Welcome to Street Talk, S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast that offers listeners a deep dive into issues facing financial institutions and the investment community. I'm Nathan Stovall, and I've just returned from S&P Global Market Intelligence Annual Community Bankers Conference, where we covered a wide range of issues focused on what it'll take for community banks to remain relevant over the next decade. We kicked off the event with a completely different issue, though, and one that is on the minds of many Americans today: the changing geopolitical landscape, the war with Iran, and upcoming negotiations with China. At the event on the morning of May 6, I had the pleasure of interviewing geopolitical strategist and renowned author, Dr. George Friedman. Here's the conversation.
I'm Nathan Stovall. I lead the financial institutions research team at S&P Global Market Intelligence, and I'm thrilled to kick off our first panel discussion really about geopolitical issues impacting markets, U.S. policy, and ultimately the economy. I've got lots of questions. I have lots of views considering that I'm a U.S. bank analyst, so obviously I'm an expert on this. No, I'm not, but thankfully I have one next to me. And George Friedman, not only has he been a forecaster and an author of many works, the Storm Before the Calm, and one of my favorites, The Next 100 Years. I've been a follower of his work since then and was thrilled to have him here. And we talked some last night and had appreciation again for this morning of you getting up in the middle of the night waiting for the developments as they're coming. And of course we had another one, but we're going to try to go through a bunch. And as I said, we will to the audience for questions. So please raise your hand and we'll recognize you then. But Dr. Friedman, let's start off talking about something we had talked about in advance of this event, and I know you've written about it as well. You've talked about how the current moment is really the end of the Bretton Woods model that came out of post-World War II, and a shift towards bilateral U.S. China relationships, really replacing the traditional U.S.-EU framework. Why is this such a big deal? What does it mean for the global economy? And why is this Trump-Xi summit in May such a pivotal moment in this shift?
In 2 minutes.
Yeah, in 2 minutes, yeah.
Well, we'll start with 1945. In 1945, the European era ended. The first global system, geopolitical system, was the European imperial system. It dominated Asia, dominated Africa, created North America, dominated Latin America. In 1945, it collapsed. It collapsed because of the internal wars of the European countries, and in part because of the emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union on both their sides, and they were much weaker. The Bretton Woods Agreement and all the other things around it were based on geopolitics. We did not want the Soviet Union to occupy Europe. Why? One was ideology. The other was that the U.S. national security is unique. We're the only nation that cannot be invaded on land unless the Canadians get really antsy. It's not going to happen. The only way we can be invaded is in the oceans, the Atlantic, the Pacific, and Japan tried that. Now, if that's the case, and we're dealing with the Soviets, the one thing we don't want them to have are ports on the Atlantic. Number one, if they get ports on the Atlantic, they may be able to challenge us on the Atlantic. And therefore, we created a system, NATO, to create a buffer to keep them away from the Atlantic ports. That's called Western Europe. Okay? Now, that system also had an economic dimension. We had to rebuild Europe. And the Bretton Woods agreements and all the things around it, the entire system was based on stopping the Soviet Union, thus strengthening the Europeans, creating trading systems that were favorable to the Europeans, having foreign aid to block this Soviet penetration of the third world countries, as we used to call them. So this was what was going on at that point. That became obsolete, not with the collapse of the Soviet Union. It became obsolete in Ukraine. In Ukraine, we discovered the Russians could not, in a few months, conquer a much smaller country, a much weaker country, Ukraine. Well, if they can't take Ukraine, and look at the map, they've got a small sliver that they're holding on to, they're not going to invade Europe. Thus, the relationship we built with the Europeans, based on massing troops in NATO, covering the costs frequently, having trade relations that were beneficial to these other countries, both in Europe and around the world, these became obsolete. It didn't make sense any longer. Now, it's hard to reach a point where everything that you grew up with, lived with, is no longer relevant. It seems like a moral outrage that you should change your thoughts. And the Europeans certainly are outraged that we are taking this position. But it was inevitable. So the entire economic system that was built around the Cold War became obsolete in the mid-20s, 2020s. It became obsolete because there was no Cold War anymore. Russia was not a major power. It was not a threat to the world in any serious way. And therefore, the economic system had to evolve as well. What we created in 1945 and later with the Bretton Woods agreements became obsolete. Now, in a world that's a strikingly thing, because this was the eternal structure of the global system. How in the world can you end it? The answer is quite easily, and it's going forward. And so there's a state of shock in the world at how the United States changed. At the same time, reality, geopolitical reality, decided that. Geopolitics drove the economics of the last cycle, from 1945. Geopolitics is driving it now as well.
So why do you think this summit in May is so pivotal with Xi? You set up the framework of, okay, we don't need NATO anymore, and that put us closer to Europe in that prior setting. In a world where we no longer fear Russia as a real threat, or no longer is tied to Europe, is the summit upcoming really saying, okay, this is about realignment because China is the person we need, or is the country we need to be most aligned with?
Well, the United States is the largest economy in the world. The Chinese is the second largest. Not really, they're third, because if the EU ever got together, the EU's GDP is larger than the Chinese. But China has a fundamental problem, which is it's a very large country. It ranks number 2 in GDP, but in per capita income, it ranks number 71. In other words, its GDP relative to its population is difficult. So the Chinese have a great difficulty. They don't have a massive domestic market to absorb the production of the world's second largest economy. They must have trade. Their number one trading partner, their exporting partner, is the United States, even to this point, okay? So they are dependent on access to foreign markets to build their economy, while they try at home, very difficultly, to build up a domestic demand. Now, with the tariffs that Trump placed on them, that reduced the amount they could export to the United States, still number 1, but it reduced it. And this created great economic crisis in the United States. Things you wouldn't like bank failures, particularly in the rural areas. Collapse of the real estate market. In China, real estate is kind of a banking system. It's what you put your money into some real estate. And that fell. So the Chinese have come under tremendous economic pressure, including unemployment, particularly among the youth and so on and so forth.
It's a 15% or something like that among young men.
And you can't get around dealing drugs very well in China. So
no other avenue.
So many problems. So basically, the Chinese are in a very difficult position. Okay. Now, the United States cannot have intimate economic ties with a country to which it has hostile military ties. As we learned during the Arab oil embargo, and recently in the Straits of Hormuz, that really, depending on someone you're going to go to war with, might go to war with, is really a bad idea from an economic point of view. And therefore, the Chinese badly need an accommodation with the United States. And the United States is in a position that it wants to have that relationship because the affordability problem. Low-cost Chinese goods brought down the price of consumer products in the United States. They have a bigger problem. We have a real problem, okay? So at this point, they're about as communist as I am. So that issue, the ideological issue, is not there, okay? So at this point, Xi, who, by the way, fired all of his army officers, all the senior army officers, including chiefs of staff, all the admirals, just a couple of months before, after a talk with Trump. And Trump is saying to him, we're not going to make a deal with you until we reach an understanding that we're not going to go to war with each other, okay? Number one. And they say, no problem. Okay, now what's the deal? Well, the deal is left to Taiwan, and we can talk about how that ends. But there is a negotiation going on between the two largest economies to reach an understanding because they don't have any fundamental geopolitical issues involved. They're not going to invade us, and we're not going to invade them. And we don't really care what they do with Saigon at this point. Has to be an accommodation. That it has to be negotiated is clear. But that it would have happened was something that could be predicted because of the Ukraine war. Once the Ukraine war was gone, there were only two major players on the street, each with fundamental problems. The Chinese were the bigger ones. Thus, May 14th is a big date. That is when they're going to get together. And remember that even though there's been a war going on in Iran, the Chinese have done very little to support them. Plus, while the war was going out, there were meetings between the Chinese Vice Minister and Besant, the Secretary of Treasury, in preparation for this summit. The Americans said it was going to be in March. The Americans said, look, we're going to have a war this week. Give us a break and let us postpone. She said, fine. How does the 14th sound? Done. Now, one of the reasons Trump really wants to end this war, he would like to go to Beijing and not have to ask for favors about ending this war from the Chinese. He doesn't want to have that on his plate. So he really wants to stop this war fast. How it got into it is another story. But if the U.S. and China reach accommodation, which both must, that changes the entire global economic system in a fundamental way. Joint ventures between U.S. and Chinese companies become possible. All these things start to happen. So we're living in a different world because geopolitics shifted.
Let's talk about how the war started. We were having that conversation last night and ahead of this, and I think that was fascinating because you hear all different kinds of things about what was really driving it. And one of the takeaways I have from talking with you is that the president very much viewed Iran as a threat, and a real credible threat, and perhaps has long looked at it as a threat. Can you talk about what led us to war and how it actually played out from an execution standpoint?
Before the war started, several months before, the United States carried out airstrikes on nuclear facilities of the Iranians. Why are we worried about these facilities? First, the Iranians are sophisticated enough to develop nuclear weapons. Second, and more importantly, Al-Qaeda, which was behind 9/11, now is given sanctuary by the Iranian government. It's not the organization it was before. We knocked down much of it. But Al-Qaeda is there. And one of the nightmares after 9/11, and I was participating in talks at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, 3 days later, what are we afraid of? A nuclear 9/11. Imagine a nuclear weapon placed on a ship with a foreign flag, maybe French or Bulgarian or whatever, sailing into New York Harbor and detonating. You've got the group that staged 9/11 under the protection of this government, and that makes us a little uneasy, okay? Now, nobody wanted, I think, in the government to say, we're afraid of a nuclear 9/11 because there would be enormous panic in the United States. So from my point of view, war was rational. I'll say something radically unwholesome. Trump is rational. Okay, live with that. And you'll start to see why he did it. Now, there are two levels of geopolitics. One level is the geopolitical reality, the other is engineering, how you carry out the things. Trump has an interesting engineering style. We'll get into that. But he went in there to take out the nuclear capability. The Iranians refused to take that out. He decided to destroy the leadership of the country. The problem was either the CIA, respect them greatly, got it wrong, or he didn't listen to them, because these civilians, Khomeini and them, did not run the country. The country was run by the IRGC, the Islamic State Revolutionary Guard. And these were the people who were ideologically and rationally in their minds going to oppose anything that happens. So the attack happened, we took out the leadership, and we were stunned to find out that, my God, we took out the wrong guys. The RGC is in charge. Now, how that engineering failure happened, I really can't tell you, but it did. And the reality is the RGC is a very powerful military capability. There's no center of gravity to it that if you killed one leader, take out this command post, they're going chaos. They have a system of defense called a mosaic system where all regional powers, regional officers have to command over that area. They can operate autonomously. Invading it would be a very bad idea and would take a very long time. This is a very strong force. And so it has to end in negotiations. The Iranians are holding out for a position that they're going to have a dominant position in the Middle East. Now, the only people who don't want that to happen is all the other countries in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia in particular, which we have a relationship with. So it gets to be a complex issue. On the one hand, the United States can invade Iran, but boy, it's going to be a bloody mess. On the other hand, the Iranians can't take the level of pressure the United States is putting on them. So there's a negotiation going on. One negotiation said we're closing the Straits of Hormuz and driving oil prices straight up the wall. The other said, don't do that. I said, we did. Now what? And that's the discussion being held right now. They've got a hand on the global economy to choke it with. And they've got everything to lose if they give in. The United States has an election coming up. It has internal problems that the RGC doesn't have. And here we are. And both sides have to reach an agreement, and both sides, in a way, desperate. And it's very hard to reach an agreement when both sides are desperate because they don't have room for maneuver. But I think we're coming to the point where we will get a settlement with Trump giving in a lot of things that he wanted from them that he's not going to get, and the Iranians giving up the one thing that he wanted, the nukes. And if I'm wrong on that, still was a very good speech I gave here.
One of the ironies of what you just said and how it maybe hasn't gone about as the president thought is that the closure has sent oil prices way higher. The rumors of, not rumors, reports of negotiations today, you see how sensitive they are. Oil prices are down $10 just on that report. But it has hurt other countries more than us, and perhaps China most, because they get so much of their oil there. Do you think that some of the decision to attack Iran is related to put pressure on China, get leverage on China ahead of this negotiation? How does that play into the whole
leading up
negotiations?
to the war, which was to some extent predictable, no one brought up the Chinese issue. And Washington leaks like a sieve. So that never came out in it. We have enough leverage on the Chinese. We didn't need more, okay? The Chinese have to be convinced that we don't have hostile military intentions toward them. So this war raging in Iran, they start to think, what is the United States? It actually made, I think, settlement a little harder, not much harder. But I don't think, although it put tremendous pressure on China, I don't think the United States anticipated the closure of the Straits of Hormuz. I don't think that was in the playbook. I could be wrong, but I don't think that was. So it was not directed against the Chinese in my mind, although it's a very nice thing to have for May 14th.
Sure, sure. And that's very logical to me when you think about the U.S. policy objectives of this White House. Closure of the strait, what that means for gas prices is not what you want heading into a midterm, I would not think.
I would like to say that one of the things that's pointed out is that forgetting global warming, oil is a very dangerous thing to be serving as the primary fuel of the global economic system. I have never had an opinion on global warming because I don't know enough about it. But I can tell you now, from a military standpoint, we've got to diversify energy. Not because of global warming, perhaps, but certainly because we've just experienced what happens when a critical choke point for oil is closed, and how it can disrupt the American economy. So this is the best argument for alternative fuels, quite apart from global warming, which is we've got a dependency that has a military vulnerability that is substantial, and we have to think this through.
That sets up sort of a natural transition. I mean, there's another dependency we have in another region in Taiwan, not related to energy, but chips. And if you think about it, you've got companies like NVIDIA who depend so heavily on Taiwan for manufacturing. You know, what do you think that you said this earlier, that Chinese and American tensions over Taiwan will ease, and what do the trade-offs look like there?
Well, first of all, understand the Chinese fear about Taiwan. There's a string of islands, Japan being an island, South Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, so on and so forth. They blocked the Chinese fleet from access to the Pacific. They're wide straits, if you will, but with current weaponry, drones and stuff like that, we can keep the Chinese out of there. If Taiwan goes into China's hands, they're much more secure. They get a block of sea from Japan all the way to the Philippines, clear access. This is what the military dimension of this negotiation is. The settlement is the Chinese say, look, you've got a basic stranglehold on our military. Let it go. We say we've got to have an understanding on the military, something conceivable. And we do. And this is why I mentioned before that he fired all the admirals and all generals. Xi did. Okay? These people were trained for war with the United States. Their entire careers was built around planning for this war. They, I think, tried to stage a coup because a few days before these firings, on social media in China, there were reports that Xi was dead. Xi had a heart attack. Wow. Now, on social media in the United States, we have all sorts of fun things. These don't usually show up in China, but they're all over the place. My read, not sure of it, was the military was going to do a coup. They heard that they were going to reach an understanding with the United States. Well, first he fired all the army generals. He discovered they were corrupt, put them in jail. Terrible corruption. He then met with Trump in South Korea. A week after that, he fired all the admirals. They were also corrupt, but not as corrupt as the military, as the army. So there's been things going on that you could see that China evolved dramatically. Now, on the question of Taiwan, things are happening. Taiwan has a multi-party system. The KMT, the Kuomintang Party, which descended from the right-wing party in China, is now pro-Chinese. The leader of that party, a woman, wants to become officially part of China, okay? And in the polls, she's ahead in Taiwan. Why? Because officially, if they can be part of China officially, but an autonomous zone, kind of like Hong Kong, but a lot more than that, really autonomous. Well, the Chinese get their symbolic thing. They're part of China. The Taiwanese still have the right for the Americans to have guarantees with them because they're in an autonomous zone. And the Chinese get access to the U.S. economy, which they really need. From the American point of view, okay, so we gave them Taiwan. What does that mean? The Chinese are businessmen. They do not want to take down the Taiwanese economy. I mean, that is something they really want. Having access to that economy would be wonderful. So there's a whole bunch of things here that can be solved. And the Chinese right now are the need to solve them. And we're seeing, because the President of the United States was going to invite the Prime Minister of Taiwan to the United States. He's anti-Chinese. He canceled that visit, but the head of the KMT party has visited the United States. Okay, so that's just prior to the negotiations in May, and we've let him know we can deal on Taiwan. Just don't humiliate us by invading, because then we'll have to do something bad. So that's where we stand on that. Taiwan is not going to be the blocking point. And so what you really need to start thinking about is what happens to the global economy. If the U.S. and Chinese companies have the ability to form joint ventures in AI and all sorts of other things, it becomes a different global system. And so we were wondering what happens after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is what comes out of that. And the Russians really are in trouble because the Chinese don't like the Russians. There were plenty of conflicts, even military conflicts, during communism. And Russia has lost the eastern part, the Central Asia. It lost the southern part, the South Caucasus, Armenia, and so on and so forth. And now the Chinese-Russian border is a question. So there's things going on in Russia that are pretty bad for them. So one thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. It's an integrated system. It's like the U.S. economy. One part withers, many other parts change. That's the integration to geopolitics.
You talked about this some earlier, but what does a weaker Russia mean for Europe, and also the idea of a stronger U.S. China relationship mean for Europe? I mean, it seems like both those things are very bad news for Europe in terms of their standing on the geopolitical
Well,
landscape.
the good news is that the Russians couldn't take Ukraine. They're not going to take Poland. Poland has emerged as a major military power and is part of the G20. So when you look at Europe, you always look at Britain, France, Germany. Look at Poland. It is the most dynamic area. I visited Serbia recently. They're on fire with U.S. investment going in all over the place, okay? Eastern Europe is really benefiting from all this. The Europeans face a fundamental problem. That's going to be the next question that has to be answered. Europe has spent the past 500 years killing each other. The Germans invaded Russia, Russia invaded. It's a madhouse. The United States imposed a reality on Europe, okay? And incidentally, landed about 200,000 troops to kind of help them or shut them up, whichever way you want to look at it. Now Europe has to decide what it is. It is potentially, as a region, larger than China economically, but it's not a region. It's an area of very different languages, different cultures, long bad memories of each other. So the question really is, what does Europe become? The bitterness of the Europeans and the Americans for pulling out is they now have to answer this question. They didn't have to answer it since 1945 because the United States defined what they were. Now they have to do it. And that is the next most important thing happening. The reality of the world is this. The United States is the only global military power and a global economic power. China is a regional military power. It does not have access to the Atlantic Ocean. It cannot operate all over the place, but it's a powerful regional economic power, military power, and a global economic power. What is Europe? It's a continent. Next story. So the point that one of the things that held Europe together was fear of the Soviet Union. Now, inside the Soviet Union, interesting things are happening. For example, they canceled the May Day parade. Every year they celebrate May Day, the day that Germany surrendered to them in World War II. It is a holy day. They've never canceled it, but they did cancel it. There are things happening inside of Russia that we're seeing that are very strange. The internet went down in Moscow. When it came back up, there was what was called a white list that you could go and everything else was off the internet. This was a serious thing that Putin condemned, that happened. Well, who could take down the internet? The FSB, the successor to KGB, the intelligence service. This is rumor, but it's strong rumor based on this, which is that the FSB does not like Putin, does not like the fact that he's carrying out the war, that he will not end the war because he's going to be humiliated, okay? And then we have Putin calling last week Trump. Usually Trump's calling Putin and puts on the table the idea of an economic relationship with the United States. Now, that's what Trump first offered. Stop the war, you'll have an economic relationship with the United States. He comes back last week with a phone call that publicly states that this is what he wants. Now Trump is saying, yeah, I'm going to do a deal with China. The Europeans are running around in circles. Yeah, we're going to bleed you. And whether Putin survives, how he survived this long, having mishandled this war catastrophically, has to do with internal politics. But the indicator that the FSB itself, which is not like our CIA, they really can't overthrow the government, fantasy stories aside, the FSB can.
Putin came from it. I mean, at least, he's
he came from KGB.
KGB. But,
KGB was like the CIA. It was a really good intelligence service. FSB likes to own factories, little things like that. So it's a very different form of organization. It's an internal one. It's less of a global operational system. So at this point, Russia is in deep crisis. We're going to have these talks with the Chinese. This is the last thing that the Russians want. They're losing Ukraine, continually claiming to go. But take a look at a map. They hardly have anything, okay? And they don't have a system for re-electing president. You go one way or the other. And so that's an internal crisis. So from that point of view, and you'll also notice the Russians really have not lifted a finger on Iran. They talk about it, but
or Venezuela, really, or Cuba, right?
Well, they made very strong statements. And for much of diplomacy, that's all they did. So we're seeing a really changing world. All the things that were the norm before the Ukraine war, all those things are shifting around. And nothing is shifting more rapidly than the economic reality. Okay, that's the most important thing to take out of this, which is people are saying Trump is violating the norms. Yeah, he's a pretty strange guy. But at this point, you have to shatter the norms. The norms are obsolete. And he's doing a very good job. I don't think he can rebuild it, but has any clue on it, but he's sure shattering it. So the United States has one fundamental cultural reality. It's an invented country. It didn't exist. It was invented at a meeting, the Continental Congress. And we are a culture of reinvention. We welcome obsolescence, we engage in various struggles, and a new reality emerges. So in a world that's undergoing massive change, the United States has a massive cultural advantage. Now, necessarily, we hate each other at these times. It's part of American culture. But we reinvent. So novelty, new ways of doing things are part of our culture. That makes us stronger. This is a dimension of geopolitics, the nature of the nations.
Questions from the audience?
You said that the one thing the Iranians want, and then I missed what that was.
It wants to be the dominant power in the Middle East. The one thing the Iranians would like to arrive at is an ideological one, the spread of radical Islam. It's a religious principle. It's like the spread of democracy. Why not? But what they really want to be is what they tried to be under the old regime before it was overthrown by the Islamists, the dominant Middle Eastern power. They're a huge country, 2.5 times the size of Texas, is the way I put it. And they're a large country, and they're a united country in many ways, because if you're not with us, you're dead. It's a good way to unify a country. This country wants to be that. We look at the Middle East, we look at Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Turkey. Okay? And this is it's not a coalition yet, but it's a reality. And we look at it and say, we really don't want the Iranians to be in control. And we don't, for various reasons. But this is a part of the destabilization of the global system. We have to redefine what the Middle East is. And Israel is undergoing a crisis here because the system that existed since they were invented in the 1940s is gone, and they're going to have to change too. So all over the world, you're seeing changing realities. And the one thing that people are frequently, they're insulted by the failure of the norm. And that's the way it goes.
One of the things we're living through right now is a series of disruptive elections here at home that are complicating our ability to project continuity on the world stage, if you will. And I know you've thought a lot about the socio and political economic cycles that America has gone through over the years since its founding. And can you help us kind of put some of that in context as terms of where we're living through this decade?
Sure. Every 50 years, the United States goes through a fundamental socioeconomic crisis. The last one was in the 1970s. 1970s is where I came of age, and everything was going apart. Riots in Detroit with the 82nd Airborne crawled out to put it down. Shootings at Kent State over the anti-war movement. Total economic breakdown. Nixon going off the gold standard. Arab oil embargo, all these things. Freezing for wages and prices too. So it was a time of basic instability. 50 years before that, it was the 1920s. And we had basic instability. It's called the Great Depression. And so why we have these every 50 years, I have no idea. Okay? I'll tell you how I discovered this. I was teaching at the Army War College, U.S. Army War College. And I was sitting with a couple of colonels who were, I will say, moaning, and the next word you can put to it, about everything they saw. And I was wondering, have I ever sat with so many people who were so unhappy, and they were slated to be generals because they were at the Army War College? What in the world was wrong? So after this discussion I had, I decided to go home and think about this. I did that because there was a waitress I really wanted to date, and she, of course, turned me down. My outcomes were 22% at best. Okay, so she didn't date me. Okay. But I went home and I went down and took a look. Did we ever do this before? And I found every 50 years. And every 80 years we have a institutional crisis. So 80 years after the founding, we had the Civil War. 80 years after that, we had the construction of the federal government during World War II. That's when the federal government really emerged as what it is. Guess what? We're 80 years away. The federal government is obsolete. One of the things I wrote in that book that was mentioned was that two institutions were going to come under heavy attack: the federal government and universities, because of that. So, in other words, just as economists can, with methodologies, do a degree of prediction on what's going to happen, and there's modeling that goes on, the same thing happens in politics and geopolitics. There are cycles. We are in the first cycle where the social and economic crisis merged with the 80-year institutional crisis, and that produced Donald Trump. So Donald Trump is a man under these crises, first creative destruction. He's probably not the man to have creative construction, but destruction he can do. But it really doesn't matter. It's not personalities. This was going to happen, I predicted in a book called Next 100 Years. I published in 2009, I think it was published. I wrote it in around 2000, that this was going to be happening here. Why? Because it kept happening the same way before. I'm too stupid to understand why the cycle is so precise, but I'm not dumb enough not to notice it. So you take a look at it, and we're in what was a predictable thing. And we're restructuring virtually every social institution. Tremendous crises. When Roosevelt was president, he was accused of being a dictator. He violated the Constitution continually, tried to stuff the Supreme Court full of more people so he'd get votes, and he was despised. He was seen as a completely reckless man. But he managed to convince the whole world that he was the friend of the poor. Now, I don't think Roosevelt ever met a poor man who wasn't a servant, but he was a friend of the poor. He conditioned himself for that time and place. And he's respected by everybody now. Who knows what we'll think about Trump? I can't imagine worshiping him, but there he is. He is just doing the same thing that Roosevelt did, destroying the old system. Remember, Roosevelt started his presidency by doing something completely illegal, closing down the banks. He had no power to close down the banks. But there was such a run on the banks, they were going to run out of money. He shut down the banks, stopped that, and so on and so forth. So at these transitional points, you get presidents who in retrospect may be deeply respected. Abraham Lincoln we love, but he was considered an illiterate fool at the time he was elected, some Kentucky redneck coming forward. So American memory is very interesting. We don't remember, but we do it again and again. It's a funny thing to watch, unless you're living through it.
Chris.
22% is pretty good, too, by the way, for the record.
Yeah, but you didn't have to beg.
Venezuela, Iran, also part of the strategy to put pressure on China than Russia? And if so, does Cuba fall into that, or is Cuba Rubio sideshow?
No, to me, it was predictable that the United States wanted to disentangle itself from the Eastern Hemisphere. Why? We had a series of wars from South Korea to Vietnam to Afghanistan to Iraq and so on. In all these wars in the Eastern Hemisphere, most of them had something to do with communism, the Soviet Union, and all that. Soviet Union having collapsed, it is rational for the United States to reduce its exposure to the Eastern Hemisphere, okay? And so was predictable that the United States was write a document saying we are lessening our interest in the Eastern Hemisphere, focusing on the Western Hemisphere. Okay? This is where we really live. This the Canadians didn't like. Tough. At the same time, when you take a look at what the issues were, the thing in Venezuela, well, that was a real thing. I don't think we had to invade, but at the same time, they were running drug cartels and also owning American businesses and operating in various ways. But it's not about that. It's about Cuba. The thing about Cuba is not Cuba itself, is the Florida Straits. The most important ports in the United States are on the Gulf Coast. It's not New York, it's not San Francisco, it's Houston, it's all the other ports. Over 50% of exports and imports flow through those ports. The straits between Key West, Florida, and Cuba is 90 miles wide. Anybody with half a brain would have mined that waterway. And the Cuban Missile Crisis had to do with nuclear weapons. It also had to do with fear that the Russians were going to mine that 90 miles. That is a critical 90 miles for the United States. And so there's always been, back to Teddy Roosevelt, wars in Cuba. And that was about this issue. And I think Trump's intention was to settle this issue once and for all. But I won't call him a subtle man, but he sometimes acts subtly. He decided to hit Venezuela first. We knew that as soon as we realized that the force that was blockading Venezuela included 2 aircraft carriers, 13 submarines, and everything else. You need 3 ships to block Venezuela. So what were all these warships doing here? They were actually far away from Venezuela. They were on the Cuban coast. So I think one of the things when the administration assumed that we now had to focus on the Western Hemisphere, as the national strategy papers showed, the Cuban question had to be answered. But Trump seems not to prefer open warfare to incredible threats and choking. And it's not a bad strategy if you're in the Army. You don't have to do the kind of things. So our view was immediately that this is not about Venezuela. That's a sideshow. This is about Cuba. And we see those negotiations proceeding. Cuba is a disaster. It's miserable. It's not Rubio. We have half the Cubans living in Florida at this point, good Americans. So we have this fundamental problem, and I think that the intention is to solve it this way, to reduce our presence. At the same time, he violated the principle, reduce our presence in the Eastern Hemisphere by attacking Iran. So it's not a clear path for engineering. So I can easily explain the geopolitical. Here's what we're going to do, everything else. And then somebody has to do it. And the people who do it face difficulties. So it's not as neat as I put it here, is going forward. And so he's dealing with the Iranians too.
In Cuba itself is not really a surprise. I mean, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but probably every president since 61, 62 would have liked to change Cuba, no matter who was in power.
Go back to Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah, you already said
We
that.
didn't want the Spanish
Yes.
in there. And we also stole the Philippines from the Spanish. But the point is that I have a theory. First, the depersonalization of politics. Politicians are people who understand reality and know how to adjust themselves to it. Okay? Now, the people who dislike the presidents think he's the one behind this reality, but effective leaders are those who understand the reality. Trump is either the personality he is, or he shaped his personality to fit the times. And that's how he became president. Now he is completely unpopular because the American public expected him to act in very different ways than he's acting, which was kind of silly having seen Trump act. So when you look at the leadership, it's very hard to make out what's happening, except to accept the fact that, like the invisible hand in economics, there's an invisible hand in geopolitics. You're going to do what you got to do, okay? And politicians, like good businessmen, understand what they got to do. So we take a look at the political system, and it can be highly predictable. And to that extent, it has some value as a methodology. But at the same time, living through it is painful, because it seems that everything that I counted on is gone. And the greatest power of the United States is to render things obsolete and go a new way. At the same time, living through this can be hell.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Friedman for a great discussion.
Thank you very much.